So Taylor Swift's songs have miraculously reappeared on TikTok, despite the feud between Universal Music Group and TikTok. This is coming ahead of Swift's new album, somewhat pompously titled The Tortured Poets Department. That's going to be releasing, I think, this Friday on April 19th, right? So I believe actually the very first week of me doing this show, this feud between Universal Music Group, UMG, and TikTok was actually the story number one. So it feels like we're kind of coming full circle in a way here. So I highly recommend you go check out that video that kind of outlines kind of what this feud is all about. But just kind of reiterate here, essentially UMG wanted a larger share of the royalty payments from TikTok. Because of course TikTok has all kinds of videos, especially now, but TikTok's real bread and butter for the longest time was music-based videos where it'd be people singing along to songs or dancing, especially. Dancing was like a huge part of it, especially during the pandemic, like the early days of the pandemic. So music's a huge part of TikTok, but UMG felt that it wasn't getting as much money from having those songs on TikTok that it should be getting. So they basically, TikTok wasn't going to acquiesce to that. So ultimately UMG, pulled the plug on it and pulled all of the music off of TikTok. And that was the first week of February. I think it officially February 1st that happened. So it's been like 2.5 months. And, I had originally predicted that something was going to give, that there was just too much money on the table for both of these parties to just leave this as it was. So how is this possible? How is this happening? Right? Because Taylor Swift is one of the artists that was removed because UMG publishes her music, at least her current music. So how is this happening? So it's not really clear, but TikTok, there's some theories about this. TikTok may have struck a separate deal with Taylor Swift, which is possible since Swift, she does own her masters and the publishing rights despite being distributed by UMG. She signed with the publishing division of UMG in 2020, but she's the one who ultimately is in control. And as we saw from this past summer, Taylor Swift is a force unto herself. And, she can really do whatever she wants, right? She's not necessarily beholden to, like this war between UMG and TikTok, right? And I think it's really important that she struck this deal, in my view, because I feel like, when I made that other video, Taylor Swift was the thumbnail. I feel like of all the artists that were removed, of which there were, unfortunately, because the industry is so, not quite a monopoly, but a duopoly or a triopoly. There's only like a few players in the space. Because of that, UMG taking their music off TikTok means there's so many like huge artists getting pulled, but the biggest one being Taylor Swift, right? So that felt like a huge blow to TikTok. So this now feels, but in reverse now, a huge blow for UMG. And why would Taylor Swift make this decision, right? Because I don't think it's really about the royalties. Because again, under the current terms, they're not really getting a huge amount of money from royalties, right? But this is really important for both parties because Variety notes that Swift used TikTok heavily for the release of her last album, Midnights, right? So the way I kind of see this is that this is really less about royalties for her and more about promotion of the album. And it will drive people to the revenue-making channels, right? So drive them to Spotify or drive them to buy the album or what have you, right? Now, Taylor Swift is allowed to do this, but again, there must have been some agreement on UMG's part to like let this happen without like throwing up a huge stink about it, right? So I guess like the big question here is like, what does this mean for the dispute, right? Because again, like I said, I felt like Taylor Swift was one of UMG's aces in the hole, right? She's one of the biggest, she's probably the biggest musical artist working today. So to remove her music, that's a huge blow to TikTok, right? And like I said before, I originally felt a deal had to be struck, right? Because there was just too much money on the table, right? It wasn't not gonna get resolved. The question was just who was gonna blink first, right? I still think that they're obviously going to figure this out at some point, though it has been quite some time now thinking about it. It's been like 2.5 months. But ultimately, this hurts UMG's leverage, right? UMG had been trying to bolster its position by, the Hollywood Reporter recently noted that UMG had struck a deal with Spotify to expand their partnership and include like more promotional tools for its artists, trying to, I guess, kind of compensate for the absence of this promotional tool of TikTok. But this sets a dangerous precedent, and not really dangerous from my point of view, but just if you're UMG, it sets a dangerous precedent that powerful artists can bypass the distributors, right? And we've already seen this with Taylor Swift, because if you recall, Taylor Swift released the concert film version of her Eras Tour last year, and she bypassed the traditional distributors, right? So she didn't have Disney or Universal or Warner Brothers distribute her concert film. She went directly to AMC theaters and brokered a deal directly with AMC theaters. So both parties got more money because there was just one less person involved, and completely cut out the middleman. And that kind of feels like what's happening here as well. Again, Taylor Swift is one of the few people who can do something like that because she has both the cultural cachet, but also TikTok and AMC, they see the dollar signs in their eyes, right? She's not just popular culturally. Her content brings in the big bucks. And the Eras Tour ended up being the highest grossing concert film of all time. And I believe almost cracking the top 10 for the year for the domestic box office in 2023. So TikTok, this was a very, very good move for TikTok and very unfortunate for UMG. And, a lot of artists represented by UMG kind of have mixed feelings about this whole feud, because on one hand, they're like, yes, we don't get enough money or as much as we want from TikTok. But on the other hand, okay, but now we're making even less money, right? And it kind of reminds me of going on strike. So in a sense, is Taylor Swift kind of like a scab in this sense that she's not like, is there kind of a lack of solidarity here by her deciding like, screw this, like I want to make sure my new album gets promoted the way I want it to be promoted and get the reach I want it to have. So I'm just going to bypass this whole conflict. I just think it's kind of interesting. Let's see the comments here. Viviana asks, any update on the potential TikTok banning? No. There has not been any update to that story. If you want, you can find, not you, Vivian, because I know you watch, but if you're watching this, I did do a whole video about TikTok being banned a couple weeks ago that you can find on my channel. But in summary, I had said that it's passed, the bill has passed the House of Representatives. Now it goes to the Senate, and the Senate in general is way more weary and less politically polarized in certain ways. So I don't think, I think a lot of people are saying that the Senate probably doesn't want to touch this, because the House of Representatives had an incentive to get this done this year because they're all up for re-election, whereas the Senate is not quite like that. So, the Senate really doesn't have a huge incentive to rush a bill through the way the House did. So, there really hasn't been any update one way or the other. The only update has been potential interested parties who would be willing to buy TikTok. But other than that, no. So maybe TikTok is kind of like, this whole thing with UMG is the least of our worries. You know what I mean? Like, we have a way bigger fish to fry. So maybe that's why a deal hasn't been reached. Vivian, I also saw you had another comment here. Taylor Swift keeps making news about owning her own music to the point of taking it off of Spotify or TikTok. Is this a growing change in the industry of artists having more control? I think so, but only if you reach that level of success, right? Taylor Swift, I remember in high school, I was in high school when Taylor Swift pulled her music off of Spotify, and it felt like the apocalypse, because I love Taylor Swift, especially at that era when she released 1989. But yeah, she's one of the few artists where she could do this and it actually matter. Because if you think about all the stuff with Joe Rogan and people like Joni Mitchell and Neil Young, right? Neil Young pulling their music off of Spotify. Even if you love those people, because I love Joni Mitchell. Who gives a shit? You know what I mean? In terms of the business, Spotify isn't like, oh no, we lost Joni Mitchell's music. In terms of the grand scheme of things, in terms of their revenue, it really doesn't. It's a drop in the bucket, right? And I believe people like, I think Neil Young, I think they've returned to Spotify. So it ended up being for nothing. And Taylor Swift, of course, also returned to Spotify, but not before getting the terms that she wanted, right? So it's the question of, Taylor Swift has this power. What will she use this power for? Will she use it to not only bolster her own success, but also use it as an opportunity to make things better for all musical artists? The way she kind of did with Spotify, I believe she was also like, it's like, I can afford to be screwed over by Spotify and their royalty formulas, but other artists can't, right? So if she uses her power for those kind of aims, that's great. If it's just because she wants to get her album to be most successful as it can be and not really caring about how this will affect other artists, then I think that could be an issue, right? But again, it's just going to be interesting to see how this affects the deal between UMG and TikTok.